5 terrifying true stories behind your favorite horror movies? There's something about horror movies that draws us in, isn't there? Maybe it's the thrill of being scared in a controlled environment, or maybe it's the fact that we can close our eyes and tell ourselves it's just fiction. But what if I told you that some of the most iconic horror movies were inspired by real-life events? Events so terrifying, they'll make you question what's real and what's just a product of our imagination. From demonic possessions to serial killers, today we're counting down the top 5 terrifying true stories that inspired some of your favorite horror movies. So buckle up and let's dive into the darkness. The Exorcist, 1973. There have been countless attempts to recreate the horror of a demonic possession on the big screen, but none have come close to the terror of The Exorcist. Released in 1973, this classic horror film tells the story of a young girl possessed by a malevolent spirit and the 2 priests who attempt to exorcise it. But what you may not know is that the film was inspired by a real-life exorcism that took place in 1949. The true story behind The Exorcist is both disturbing and fascinating. In 1949, a 14-year-old boy known as Roland Doe underwent a series of exorcisms in St. Louis, Missouri. The ritual was performed by 2 Catholic priests who claimed to have seen the boy's body contort and twist in ways that defied human explanation. The exorcism was performed over several weeks, with the priests eventually claiming that they had successfully rid the boy of the demon. But what's even more chilling is that the event was witnessed by several people, including a journalist who documented the entire process. The story was later adapted into a novel by William Peter Blatty, who then turned it into the iconic film we know today. But the real-life exorcism of Roland Doe still sends shivers down people's spines, and it's easy to see why it inspired one of the most terrifying horror movies of all time. The film's success can be attributed to its slow-burning tension and graphic descriptions of possession, which were unprecedented for its time. But what really sets The Exorcist apart is its ability to tap into our deep-seated fear of the unknown. The idea that our bodies can be taken over by malevolent spirits is a terrifying concept, and it's something that continues to fascinate and horrify audiences to this day. The Exorcist's impact on the horror genre cannot be overstated. It paved the way for a new wave of horror films that explored the supernatural and the occult, and its influence can still be seen in modern horror movies. But what's even more chilling is that the real-life exorcism of Roland Doe remains one of the most well-documented cases of demonic possession in history. The story of The Exorcist is a reminder that sometimes reality can be far more terrifying than fiction. And it's a testament to the power of horror movies to tap into our deepest fears and anxieties. Psycho, 1960. Moving on to our next terrifying true story, let's talk about the infamous serial killer Ed Gein, who inspired the character of Norman Bates in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. Ed Gein was a quiet, unassuming man who lived in rural Wisconsin in the 1950s. But behind closed doors, Gein was leading a life of unspeakable horrors. He was known to have exhumed corpses from local graveyards, fashioning clothing and furniture from their skin and bones. Gein's farm was a house of horrors, filled with the remnants of his twisted experiments and a collection of human skulls. Gein's crimes were only discovered when police arrived at his farm in response to a missing persons report. What they found was a scene straight out of a horror movie: human skulls, skin flayed from corpses, and even a pair of lips pulled over a wooden spoon to create a makeshift mask. Gein was arrested on the spot, and his subsequent trial would become one of the most sensationalized cases of the 20th century. But what's even more fascinating is how Gein's life influenced the creation of Norman Bates, the infamous serial killer from Psycho. Hitchcock was allegedly inspired by Gein's crimes, using them as a starting point to create one of cinema's most iconic villains. And while Norman Bates is undoubtedly a work of fiction, his character is rooted in the twisted reality of Ed Gein's crimes. Gein's impact on popular culture extends far beyond Psycho, however. His crimes have inspired countless serial killer movies and TV shows, including The Silence of the Lambs and American Horror Story. He's become a cultural touchstone for horror fans, symbolizing the darkest corners of the human psyche. The case of Ed Gein is a grim reminder that serial killers are not just figments of our imagination, but real people who walk among us. It's a sobering thought, and one that adds a layer of complexity to our obsession with horror movies. The Amityville Horror, 1979. Next up, let's explore the terrifying true story behind the Amityville Horror. In 1974, George and Kathy Lutz moved into a large Dutch colonial house in Amityville, New York. The house had a dark history. Just a year earlier, Ronald DeFeo Jr. had murdered 6 members of his family within its walls. But the Lutz family was not deterred, believing that the house's dark past would not affect them. However, it soon became clear that the house had a mind of its own. The Lutz family reported all manner of paranormal activity, from moving objects to unexplained noises and ghostly apparitions. They even claimed to have seen the ghost of a young boy, who would later become a central figure in the horror movie adaptation of the events. But what's even more fascinating is that the Lutz family's claims of paranormal activity were corroborated by several eyewitnesses, including a local priest who performed a blessing on the house. The events were so intense that the Lutz family eventually fled the house, leaving behind many of their belongings. The story of the Amityville haunting has become a cultural phenomenon, inspiring countless books, movies, and documentaries. But at its heart, it's a tragedy, a family torn apart by forces beyond their control. The Amityville haunting is a powerful reminder that the veil between the living and the dead is thin indeed. It's a sobering thought, and one that's only intensified by the fact that the events are rooted in reality. The Conjuring. Moving on to our next terrifying true story, let's delve into the world of paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren, who inspired the events of The Conjuring. In the 1970s, the Perron family moved into a small farmhouse in Rhode Island, only to discover that it was haunted by a malevolent spirit. Desperate for help, they turned to Ed and Lorraine Warren, 2 paranormal investigators who claimed to have the power to rid the house of its unwanted guest. What followed was a series of intense seances and exorcisms, as the Warrens attempted to rid the house of the malevolent spirit. But what's even more fascinating is that the events were witnessed by several people, including the Perron family themselves. The Perron family's haunting experience was only one of many cases that the Warrens investigated throughout their careers. They were known for their expertise in the supernatural, and their services were sought out by people from all over the world. The Warren story was eventually adapted into the horror movie The Conjuring, which tells the story of their investigation into the Perron family's haunting. The film was a massive success, and it's easy to see why. The events are rooted in reality, making them all the more terrifying. The story of the Perron family's haunting is a powerful reminder that the supernatural is all around us, waiting to pounce. It's a sobering thought, and one that's only intensified by the fact that the events are rooted in reality. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. Finally, let's talk about the terrifying true story behind the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. In the 1950s and 60s, Ed Gein, yes, the same Ed Gein, committed a series of heinous crimes in rural Wisconsin, including murder, cannibalism, and desecration of graves. But what's even more fascinating is how his crimes inspired the creation of Leatherface, the iconic serial killer from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The film's director, Tobe Hooper, was allegedly inspired by Gein's crimes, using them as a starting point to create one of cinema's most iconic villains. And while Leatherface is undoubtedly a work of fiction, his character is rooted in the twisted reality of Ed Gein's crimes. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre was released in 1974, and it quickly became a cult classic. Its graphic violence and intense atmosphere made it a landmark of the horror genre, and it's easy to see why. The film's roots in reality make it all the more terrifying. The story of Ed Gein is a grim reminder that serial killers are not just figments of our imagination, but real people who walk among us. It's a sobering thought, and one that adds a layer of complexity to our obsession with horror movies. So there you have it, 5 terrifying true stories that inspired some of the most popular horror movies of all time. From demonic possessions to serial killers, these stories are a powerful reminder that reality can be more terrifying than fiction. Want to know more of the background? What is totally true, a reality, and what may be a lit more imaginative MYTH? Check it out in the community tab.